Hey, it's Josh.
And Aaron.
We would like your help to grow our channel.
If we can grow to 8,000 subscriptions,
we're going to give you this Indominus box.
The rules are simple. Subscribe to the channel now, and when we reach 8,000 subscribers, we're going to put out a special thank you video. Everybody who comments on that video will be entered to win this Indominus box.
Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button.
Will people follow?
I hope so.
This episode brought to you by Cornflakes. Eat them with blood. Also by subscribers like you. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of This Old 40K. This week we are going to be taking a look at my custom-made, custom-built, laser-cut Necron terrain, the entire process that I went through not only to learn how to design, but also how to assemble, paint, and build my own terrain. Also, remember to like and subscribe, hit that bell button so you never miss an update. We are so close to 8,000 subscribers. We'll be crossing that mark very soon with your help, so don't miss out on winning the Indominus box set. Subscribe now. And if you like the painting tutorial in this video, that is because it comes from CGN's very own Josh. You can check out his rusty Necron scheme in the notes below, or find it in our terrain and painting playlist. This week we're going to be taking a look at the process that I used in order to design, cut, build, and paint my own custom Necron 3D terrain. To do this, I will be using a program called Adobe Illustrator. Designing in Adobe Illustrator allows me to make two-dimensional shapes that will be assembled into a three-dimensional object. You can think about it like building each side of a cube. Now, in this particular case, I knew that I wanted to use multiple types of materials, so I worked on building not only the box, essentially, that each one of the terrain pieces was going to be in, but also building inlays that I could either cut out of a different material or that I could reuse in order to create additional detail on the miniature terrain pieces. For some of my larger terrain pieces, I actually used acrylic. Now, I need to point out some help that I got. Some of that education came from Christopher Masto's YouTube channel, where he has an excellent video on how to set up Adobe Illustrator for Glow-forge. And after watching his video, he saved me a lot of time. I also experimented in this project with adding patterns to the surface of the buildings that I was creating. So I went with like a hexagon pattern. So some of the obelisks that I made, instead of cutting out all the detail, I actually etched some detail. And I wound up really liking this experiment. And in future terrain projects, I am going to do a lot more etching of detail onto the surface and not just straight up cutting. Once I designed my main shape, I then could work on my cutouts, and I had to make sure that these cutouts were the right size so that I could later use them as inlays in order to accentuate the details on the terrain. I have a lot to learn on designing for laser cutting. For one, I did not use any tabs in this project, and I did not use a whole lot of etching techniques or drawing techniques. Bottom line is that I can get a lot more efficient overall with learning how to use Adobe Illustrator, and I think that when I started this project, just making the first obelisk took me about 6 hours, but by the time I was, getting to my last piece, it only took me maybe like 20 or 30 minutes to design it. Also, some of my designs are not 100% from my own head. I also utilized designs that were available on Thingiverse from Bilbostomper, who I will put in the notes below. For example, the stairs that you are seeing right here came from his design, and I only modified them slightly. So I modified the bridge to put a Necron logo on it. I also used his hexagon pattern and put that onto some of the terrain. So this was definitely a combination of me learning how to manipulate other people's files as well as creating files from scratch. And I definitely have a lot to learn when it comes to designing your own terrain or designing really anything for laser cutting. I would also like to give a shout out to Skillshare. Skillshare is definitely not sponsoring us. I found out about Skillshare because of YouTube sponsors, but I did sign up and used it for learning Adobe Illustrator, and their classes were fantastic. Going from Photoshop to Illustrator, I thought was going to be an easy transition. Actually turned out to be quite a hard transition, so I was really happy about the classes that I used on Skillshare. Once the files are complete, The next step is to save them as an SVG file and then send them over to the laser cutter. I was very lucky in that none of my files had any significant problems. Pretty much everything I printed came out correct. I believe that there was only one issue on one part where I mistakenly forgot to put in 2 cut lines, but fortunately it was super easy to fix, and overall the actual laser cutting everything went very well. Now this is in stark contrast to 3D printing, where it seems like things go wrong in 3D printing all of the time. At least that's been my experience with 3D printing. I have found laser cutting to be a breath of fresh air. It may be a bit more limited in the amount of details that you can get, but I find it to be a much more user-friendly medium for creating and building my designs. Once all of your pieces are cut, the next step is to assemble them. Now, all of the material that you get for your laser cutter is going to have a paper backing on it, which you need to remove first. Typically, this isn't too bad of a situation, but sometimes when you get down to some of the smaller details, it can get time-consuming and annoying to remove all of those pieces of paper. Once all the pieces of paper are removed, it was time to start assembling my different pieces. Now, all of the pieces rely on pretty much 2 principles. 1, creating a box, and then 2, creating some sort of relief detail on the box utilizing the cutouts that I had designed into the box. And in order to do that, I used a pair of elbow clamping tweezers, typically used for jewelry making, in order to hold the piece slightly above the surface, and then I simply super glued the piece down, and I continue to do that for every piece on all of my terrain. Once all of those had their details on them, it was time to assemble the boxes. Now, this is where I should have designed tabs in order to make sure the boxes always sat square, but fortunately I did take into account the thickness of the material, and overall I got very nice pieces of terrain that fit together well. On my larger pieces of terrain, instead of using the same piece that I cut out of the original board in order to create the detail, I actually cut acrylic pieces to fit as the detail. Now, in this particular case, I got lucky, but I definitely learned some techniques. So the acrylic melted a little bit more than the wood burned, so the pieces did not press fit exactly perfectly where I wanted them to go. I'm going to have to adjust that in the future, but overall this concept worked really, really well. I used acrylic that was twice as thick as the material that I cut the structure out of, and I was able to get this nice relief inlay that picked up the light really well, and overall I was extremely satisfied with the look of these miniatures, and I even left space so later on I can add electronics into them if I want to add things like LEDs or sounds. Now here you might notice a mistake, and that is everything has been fully painted, but I am now attaching it to a base. About halfway through this project, I decided that I wanted to add bases to all of my terrain. That was partly for looks, because I thought having everything on hexagons might be kind of cool, but it was also for the new 9th edition rules, which seem to be getting a little bit more confusing when things aren't area terrain. So about halfway through the project, I decided to put everything on a base. I strongly recommend, if you're making terrain, if you're going to make area terrain, or if you're going to have a base, to put that base on before you paint. With that being said, let's get on over to basing. For basing, I use just regular old school glue, PVA glue. The brand that I'm using in this particular case happens to be Gorilla, but it's just regular old PVA. So I put it down. I then used an old brush to get a nice even layer across all of the base, and I also made sure that a little bit of the glue was touching the bottom of the terrain and the base so that that would also get a nice adhesion. After that, I applied a medium grit sand. This is more of a sand that you would find for a sandbox and not so fine as a sand that you would typically use on the base of a miniature. After I got all of my bases well glued and sanded, I then let them dry overnight. I find that PVA glue, particularly for basing with sand, functions much better if you let it dry overnight instead of just a couple hours. The next day I knocked off the extra sand, and then using a very soft brush, I brushed off any remaining sand that was stuck, and what you'll find is that you have a nice thick layer of sand left. After that, I took some rocks. I don't remember what brand of rocks these are, and some PVA glue. I ran a bead of PVA glue all the way around each side of my terrain pieces, and then just stuck the rocks right to that side. For my bases that were a little bit larger, I also used these rocks to create some mounds and do some extra detail, but on the smaller pieces of terrain, it was just this nice rim of rocks that I felt made it look like maybe these pieces of terrain were either coming out of the ground or had been there for a while and had stuff starting to collect all around them. And just to reiterate, once again, definitely do your basing before you paint so that you can paint all of it at once. Now we are going to pretend that I painted these in the correct order, and everything I'm doing is going to be very simple. First of all, I am using craft paints. For the first step, we are going to be making a black wash that is a 1-to-1 ratio of acrylic black paint to water, or 2-to-1 if you want it to be a little bit thinner. And I am using a Games Workshop brand scenery brush, which I actually don't recommend because over the course of this project, it actually shed a lot of hair all over my work. So this is the last project that I will be using with the GW scenery brush. Once you have your paint all nice and mixed up, we're just going to go ahead and get this black wash all over the entire model, including the base, and just have everything with a thick coat of black wash. I paid special attention to the bottom and the rocks to make sure that it seeped into all of those nooks and crannies. But once the bottom was done, I then thinned out the paint just a little bit more, and using the scenery brush, I gave the entire model a coat of a black wash. And then I went back using a paper towel and I dabbed most of that wash off. This is going to give us a nice grungy undercoat that collects in the low parts and comes off of the high parts, and it will also give a nice uniformity and connection between the model and the base. Next, we are going to be stippling on black paint using 100% acrylic. We're not watering it down whatsoever. We are just going to be tapping off some of the excess black onto our paper towel, and then we're going to go all around trying to get some more black grunge over the model. This is really going to help weather it and age it and pull that black wash into the other colors. We are going for sort of a rusty old look, and I like to start that with a black wash and then a black stippling. The only non-craft paint that we are using today is Citadel's Leadbelcher Air, and I have to say I don't recommend this paint for doing anything other than what I am about to do with it. It is a terrible airbrush paint, and it is a terrible layer paint, and just in general, I'm extremely dissatisfied with the Citadel Air brand, which is too bad because I was very excited about it, and I actually bought like 4 bottles of Citadel Air Leadbelcher along with some other colors. But what we're going to be doing with it today, it will be just fine, and that is we are going to stipple on silver over the rest of the model in order to start building out that rusty metal look. Next, we're using Craft Red, and that's right, we are following the exact same pattern as each one of the paint schemes before. We are going to be using the base brush to stipple on red. I like doing the red after the silver because it lets you tone down some of that silver, and if you want to bring some of the silver back, of course you can add some silver later, but I much prefer going black, then silver, then red for creating rust. Lastly, we are going back to black, and we are going to be applying one more layer of stippled on black that is just going to tone down a little bit of the red and draw everything together. It's really going to solidify our dingy, grungy, dirty, ancient look. If this paint scheme looks familiar, it should. I am using Josh's Rusty Crons paint tutorial, which was posted just a couple weeks ago. This terrain is going to match his army and should look fantastic on the board. So if you want to paint your armies rusty Necrons, go ahead and check out our tutorial. It will be in the notes below and the card above. The last step for all of the terrain pieces that do not have the green acrylic inlays, we are going to be painting our raised details with Citadel Layer Paint Moot Green. Now, it did take 2 coats to get this looking nice, but overall was a very simple way to add that awesome Necron class. Lastly, we are going to paint our bases, and once again we are pretending that I did all of these in the correct order, where the base and the model itself was primed together, and where the first layer of black on our base was a wash that was also used on the building. We of course know that that's not true for all of the pieces of terrain, but once again, in order to paint the base, we're going to be making a 1-to-1 ratio of black acrylic paint and water, and we are going to be gently covering all of our sand. Now this is also going to help hold down the rest of the sand, so it's really not too bad that I did some of it out of order. But for the pieces of terrain where I had to paint the bottom separate, I had to gingerly go back in and paint the rocks around the edge, trying not to get too much paint up onto the models themselves. Once that was done, we are on to our last step where I'm dry brushing Miniature's base gray airbrush paint on top of it, and that is the only detail that we're going to be doing to the base. That is a black wash on the bottom, essentially some black paint, and then a gray highlight. I think it looks fantastic, and it's very simple. Overall, I give my first venture into custom designing and building my own laser cut terrain a B-. I have a lot to learn when it comes to the designing aspect of it, particularly how to make tabs so that my construction goes together easily and maintains all of its angles appropriately. I also need to learn how to maximize the space that my designs take up so that I use less material when cutting it out, and most importantly, I need to learn how to make finer design elements using etchings and inlays in order to really take the terrain to the next level and get it to something that you would buy, say, from TT Combat. All of that being said, though, I am extremely satisfied and very happy with this terrain, and I can't wait to start on my next terrain project. And if any of you are thinking about jumping into the laser cut terrain arena, or if you just don't want to do 3D printing, I strongly recommend that you check out Laser Cut Terrain, whether you make it yourself or if you buy it. This episode brought to you by cornflakes. Eat them with blood.
Yeah.
Be quiet. Shh.